Hello, thank you for coming to the Insight into Action webinar today. Hopefully it'll be really useful for you. My name is Chris Whitaker. I'm a Regional Engagement Advisor in the East and South East with Activity Alliance. And just to give you a very brief introduction to me and my journey with Insight, I started to use Insight a few years ago when I used to work for a third sector organisation who wanted to be more insight and evidence based in terms of their customer approach. So we use the insight sources and methods when I talk about today to help do that. And since then, I have used that to use those skills with Activity Alliance to make us more insight based, particularly in terms of what Sport England requirements are like. So hopefully it will be a useful introduction to the topic today. To give you an overview of what we're going to do, 3 objectives. Firstly, to talk you through the process of gathering and using insight based on the Activity Alliance Insight resource. The good news is that if you've not used that resource, I'll talk very much from first principles today, so don't worry, and then I'll build on those on the resource a little bit as well. Secondly, to expand, as I say, and to give you some practical strategies of how to translate insight into action and make sure it has an impact. And thirdly, to invite you to have a clear and structured plan to allow you to keep on top of your insight, maximise the value you gain from it, and keep it up to date. Okay, so first things first, I'll start with a definition. I come from Cambridge, and so we don't use the Oxford English Dictionary in these parts. Thank you very much. The Cambridge English Dictionary, as you would expect, choose my local rules, says that the definition of insight is the ability to have a clear, deep, and sometimes sudden understanding of a complicated problem or situation. So that gives us some hints as to why we should use insight. Firstly, it's important to know our audience. While we're working in sport and physical activity or even in non-sport, we've got to know who our customers are, who we're going to want to engage with in terms of the disabled people. It's really key to gather that audience to understand their needs, their circumstances, their demographics, and so on and so forth. Secondly, it gets us away from throwing spaghetti at the wall and sticking our finger in the air and towards a more evidence-based approach, so we can maximise the application of the limited resource, the finite resource that we've got. And by extension, we can make a difference. Making a difference is what gets us out of bed in the morning and working in sport and physical activity. So we want to use insight to maximise our ability to reach people and take the life-changing stuff in sport and physical activity to them to help maximise their potential and make active lives possible. Insight is the key to doing that. In terms of a process, I love a process because I'm a geek. I'm quite happy to be a geek, as will become apparent as we speak. The first bit of text in black is you've got to have a clear purpose. The purpose isn't just to gather all the data and see what happens. We've got to have a clear question in our mind as we speak about what we're doing. So the objective might be to understand the number of physically inactive people locally. It might be to understand the amount of people that we have who have a physical disability locally or a sensory impairment locally, and so on and so forth. Once we've got that question clear in our heads, we can use it to help guide, shape, and inform the subsequent steps that we have to take. Second stage of that is to review the information sources that are available to us, and there are lots, as we'll discuss and describe. Third part is to begin to bring that information to life and to apply it in the real world by looking at key stakeholders. Then we gather our information together, so quantitative and quantitative information, using our on-the-ground intelligence from our stakeholders and our evidence on our data sources. We then want to make sure that, having put a lot of effort in to get to this point, that we check it and test it to make sure that it is an accurate picture, or as accurate as we can make it. We then have a plan and development phase to bring the information to life as we seek to answer the question that we set out with, and then we review it. The world is changing, the world is constantly moving, and disability is no exception. So we need to review our information periodically. It's an ongoing process and not an event. Hence the continuous flow that we see in the diagram. This doesn't stop, it continues to evolve and move forward, and rightly so. So in terms of the disability information out there, let's have a look at our data sources so that we can begin to answer the question, where do we go to get this deeper understanding where disability insight is concerned? There are loads out there, to use a technical term, but and some of those are referenced in the resources, but there are more. So we'll talk through a range of data sources that are out there. The good news is that they're all publicly available, free and easy to access. The most difficult thing that you'll have to do is a short registration, but then you're home and hosed. So there is no excuse for not being able to use the information that's out there. You just need to know where to go, and that's where this section comes in. Okay, so firstly, we start with the Active Lives Survey. This will give us a wealth of information about disability support and physical activity patterns locally. It will tell us how many people are active, inactive, in between. That's really important in order to understand the physical activity landscape. The next two, pansy and poppy, they sound like flowers, they're not. They are demographic data sources that are available that give us really detailed pictures about populations both 18 to 64 and 65 and over, published by the Institute of Public Care or Oxford Books University. Really important and credible data sources that are used by all sorts of people. NOMIS, loads of disability information out there, particularly the census that we'll come back to a few times in this webinar. Particularly important data source because of its robustness and the depth it provides. And the Care Quality Commission. Now, this is a real neglected nugget of information by a lot of people, but really helpful in terms of helping to tell us where care providers are, different types of care markets, who the main movers and shakers are locally, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk more about that. So in terms of why each of these data sources is useful, Active Lives can tell us about the activity or not that's going on locally, and also the variation between places. Pansy and poppy, as we'll see, provide a really detailed understanding of different age ranges and groups. And we can break down that understanding by district, local authority and region, so going into some quite fine detail in terms of our geography there as well, and allowing comparisons between areas, which it might be important in terms of being able to target certain geographies where there might be higher or lower levels of population. Notice very important sources of information, including the census, what makes a census stand out is it's undertaken once every 10 years, everybody has to take part in it, but it's also a self-report measure, and we'll talk more about that too. Care Quality information, Care Quality Commission information, by looking at the types of providers and where they're located, we begin to understand a couple of things. The first is that where all the disabled people or some of the disabled people might be. Unfortunately, there's not a phone book and we don't know each other, but actually by looking at things like care settings and day centres that are available in particular areas, then we begin to understand where some of the disabled people might be. Also, by looking at the providers that are active in particular geographical areas, we can begin to see who our key stakeholders might be, who might have access to disabled people and experience and expertise of working with them, which is valuable. In terms of PANSI, that stands for Projected Adult Needs and Service Information, and now you see why we abbreviate it. These are industry standard indicators, so these both pansy and poppy are used by local authorities and others. These demographic projections are used by local authorities and others to help understand forecast demand for services, so we can be really confident about the information that they provide. So in terms of pansy, we can get information on learning disability, physical disability and mental health in those categories that are displayed there. And here's an example of the kind of information we get. So detailed understanding about different types of disability population in particular geographical areas. So here we see the 5 years between 2017 and 2021, and the detailed breakdowns for Brighton and Hove. The eagle-eyed amongst you will note a couple of things. Firstly, the button that says show 2017 to 2035. If we click on that, we'll get 5 yearly interval information. The reason why that is helpful is if we want a much longer term view about the trends of population type over time, then that will give us that. The download button is really key as well, because both Pansy and Poppy allow information to be exported really easily into Excel file format, so that allows us to build up a data set of information really quickly and easily too, which is helpful. So Poppy, same or similar thing, but for 65 years and over. Because it is 65 years and over, the main difference between Pansy and Poppy is the focus on health. As we know, unfortunately, as we get older, health conditions become more pronounced and more visible in nature. So that's why we see things like falls, strokes, visual impairment, hearing impairment, and so on, focused in on Poppy. But we also have living status. Our living status changes as we get older, support arrangements, and learning disability information as well. To give you an example of a screenshot of the information that's available from Poppy, here's one for Buckinghamshire in terms of domestic tasks. Now, domestic tasks are, and I've deliberately used this example because here is an example of what we would call a proxy measure. So a proxy measure is something that we might use to indicate something else. So in this particular example, the data set focuses on people who are unable to manage one domestic task. There are a number of domestic tasks included here, such as household shopping, washing and drying clothing, deal with personal affairs and do practical activities. Here, there is a good practice that we could use this as a data source for people who are more likely to be inactive, because if we say, for example, that they might store to wash and dry dishes, do practical activities, they're more likely to be inactive. So as long as we use that as a rough approximation, and we use that in a consistent way across all the data that we collate, that's fine to use it in that way, just as long as we're clear that it's a rough indicator rather than a specific detailed one. Again, you can download the information and look at the information in 5 yearly intervals as opposed to 1 yearly intervals if you wish to. You might want to think at this point about how you would use this information with reference to questions that you would have. So does this, for example, the information that's available, open up new data sources to you, new ways of understanding the population that is available? Were you not aware of anything that we've just talked about? Have a think about that at this point as we move forward. Okay, and there's more. There's always more with Insight, which is generally a good thing, although as we'll establish later, there does come a point where we need to draw a line in the sand. There's information about disability benefits available, so both for disability living allowance and personal independence payment. Personal independence payment is the newer form of disability benefits for those who are eligible. You will find more people on personal independence payments and less people in terms of numbers on disability living allowance as people complete the transition over to the newer form of disability benefit. The reason why it's useful is it's a further indication of the disability population. And as we begin to understand the different data sets that are available, what we need to do is we need to think about it a bit like an onion. So what we're doing is we're building up the layers of our onion, and what we need to do is what's called triangulate the data. So we need to use the different layers of information that's available to us together. And hopefully what we'll see is that the different layers of information are pointing to broadly consistent conclusions about, for example, the size of our disability population, the size of a certain age group, the range of disability population available. If the data sources point to broadly similar conclusions, we can be more confident about them. If there are any differences, we need to ask why. What it is important not to do is just use one data source, because we need to be detailed and cross-reference everything to be sure that we're gathering data and using data in a robust way. Speaking of robustness, the census is really important. Everybody has to do it once every 10 years. It's a detailed exercise. The census data is also available at a ward level, so it allows even more detailed understanding than a lot of the other data sources that are available that only allow us to go down to a local authority or district level, which is important in terms of having granular understanding. Public health, lots of public health information available that will help us build a profile of the health needs of our local population, as well as further demographics. And commissioning is key. Commissioning is what the services, particularly from a local authority perspective, commissioning local authority commissioners will undertake analysis to understand what the needs of a particular population will be. So, for example, they may say that the needs of population are changing as they get older. If we can then understand, right, well, how can we provide solutions to those aging population, then that provides us a common basis with which to work with people, which might be helpful. And it will also help us to understand about what we're likely to see about the shape of local services and local markets. As we've said, that is a summary of why these sources of information are useful. Just to recap. And now that we've been over lots of different data sources, I want to pose a question to you. Think about how this data can help you answer your questions as an organisation. You've got lots of different layers and sources of information that are available to you. How are you going to use those different sources of information to be more insight-led in what you do? Okay, so hopefully you've had a bit of opportunity for reflection into that question and how to use the data sources together. When I was using this data sources and do my own insight work, it's really useful to think about the needs of a population and to interrogate the data, to explore differences, to explore particularly local patterns is really helpful, and variations in local patterns, particularly when we're looking for two things: evidence of need, so need in a particular area, evidence of provision as well is key. and the types of provision that might be available locally. So what are the needs that we could meet as a result of what we're seeing from the localized picture? Another key part of the puzzle is to look at who the key stakeholders are and to gather information about them and how they work. Because the data that you only gather is what you do with it and how you use it. It's really key to understand how this information functions in practice. It's all about moving towards that deeper understanding. So how does that information work in practice? Who are key players? The world runs on relationships, particularly where the disability world is concerned. So how are we going to be able to put the information and the questions that we might have as a result of gathering that information? How are we going to be able to begin to answer those questions with reference to our key players? And our key players can help shed further light and build common understanding to the issues that we're trying to address. So to that end, understanding who the key movers and shakers are by carrying out stakeholder mapping is really essential in order to help us understand who those key players are and who we need to be talking to. We also need to check and test. And checking and testing is important in order to make sure that we have captured this complex picture as accurately as we can. Having come this far, we want to make sure that we're on the right track, and we do that by asking the people that we know, or if we're really clever, we ask the people that we're wanting to target to work with and work alongside as part of that process. Because the best forms of gathering insight recognise that this is a process. It doesn't just happen once and then everything's neat and tidy and then we go back. You have to go back and forth. There's a bit back and forth, bit of checking and testing the information. If we're really clever, we'll bring in those people that we're looking to work with anyway and say, we found this conclusion. We found that our biggest demographic population is in Ipswich and the biggest area between the biggest age group, is between 40 and 55. How does that look? Does that tally with your understanding? And a particularly distinctive feature of working with disabled people are gatekeepers. So gatekeepers are those individuals or those organisations who we can work with to be able to unlock the disability population, to be able to gain credibility, trust and understanding by working with those individuals who are gatekeepers is essential. By working with them, we can provide reassurance and use the credibility that our gatekeepers have to help us be more effective in understanding and engaging our disability populations. There are a few rules of thumb in terms of checking and testing. The first is trust your gut. If it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. If something stands out to you, then check it and check it again. You want to make sure that what you're gathering at this point is authoritative so you can depend on it and use it to guide your analysis. And don't be afraid to make revisions. We don't all get it right first time, and that's part of the course. But if you're on your 11th draft of your shiny Excel spreadsheet, and that is the point that you've got to move on, diminishing returns will apply, and it's only when you put the information into practice that it will have real value. It's only when you act on that information that it will have real value. So don't be afraid to put the further drafts to bed and begin to roll your sleeves and actually apply this information and test it out in real life. I want you to think about now at this point, imagine that you have gathered information, that you understand how populations are organised locally. What are some of the techniques that you could use to be able to engage those key stakeholders that you want to work with, having identified them. So to give you an example, it might be an information event or an engagement day, for example, that would help you to begin to engage with people. But what are the other means available to you? Have a think about that before we move on. The next stage in our process is bringing it to life. The whole purpose of gathering this information, taking the time to check it, test it, involve people along the way, is to use it to make a difference. So how are we going to do this? In this section, I'll present some examples of how you might go about doing that. The first such example comes from DS Active, and it's the mapping example. Mapping is commonly used because back to our definition, we spoke about achieving moments of sudden understanding, and there is something about mapping information that helps things become clear, that helps us to see patterns and trends in the data, in the way that things are organised, that we don't see before. And to that end, there are lots of mapping software options that are available to you that are either free or of low cost and that are easy to use. And a couple of examples of those are Batch.io and Mapline, so that we can take our data and produce maps like this one. And here is another good example from Living Sport. So Living Sport in Cambridge and Peterborough use mapping to have a disability sport directory to signpost people to activities. And we can see there, we can begin to see clusters in the data. We can begin to see patterns in what types of activities are available locally. There might be, for example, opportunities to develop activities in more rural areas. We might look in another geographical area and find actually there are lots of activities already on here. So rather than focusing on developing new activities, we want to focus on signposting to existing ones. And Living Sport also knew that if people phone them up, they can signpost people to this directory and people can look in their own time. So it prevents questions being asked on a repetitive basis, which is a more efficient way to work. There are loads of things that you can do having built your data up. So some of those things include understanding local populations, baselining populations, exploring differences and patterns in where particular types of populations might be located. So, for example, we might want to find out where the biggest geographical concentrations are, so we can do some targeted work in those areas. And we might also want to provide evidence of need. So if our demographics show that there's a big population locally and some health needs, then that's really key evidence of need, which we can use to, for example, apply for funding and justify why that funding is needed. We can also do a lot of asset mapping of populations to understand what assets are available locally, and we can work with stakeholders to review our stakeholder mapping and see who, where, and what key stakeholders are doing in particular areas. A key part of working with Insight is having a clear and targeted plan to shape what you do. So, and use that plan to help your Insight continue to evolve in practice. So, examples of questions that we would use in planning stages. What next? So what? You've learned this information. What are you going to do with that? How are you going to use that to shape your activities? going forward. What sources of information are you going to use to collect information? Are there any new sources of information that you've learned in this resource that you need to go and investigate and explore more? How can you use this information to develop a local or regional picture? Might you be able to develop a resource off the back of that to educate not only external audiences, but maybe internally in terms of your teams and organisations too? How can you use this information to identify what common priorities locally might be or common needs locally? And might you be able to use mapping to help you to understand data in a new way when you can visualize it? Just take a moment to think about what your insight plan might look like and how you might use it going forward. Try to think of between 1 and 3 things that you could do after this webinar to start bringing your information to life. So between 1 and 3 things that you can use the information that you found in this webinar to bring your own insight to life. I would say in terms of bringing the information to life is keep it simple. I've always been told to keep it simple. It might be something as simple as understanding what populations are in local areas as a basis for further work. That itself will be a great start in terms of being more targeted and being more evidence-led. And sometimes, particularly when you started out, less is more.
So to round off the webinar, just to give you a few key takeaways and next steps to think about. As we've talked about, it's really important to be informed by insights, and I hope I'm preaching to the choir now on that one. Really important that we get away from trying to throw spaghetti at the wall or sticking our fingers up in the air and hoping for the best. It's really important to use a range of insight sources in a layered way. So make sure that we're not just using one source of insight, but we're using several and exploring the differences and layers between them. The engagement you have is only as good as the engagement, the insight you have is only as good as the engagement you have on the ground. So working with your local stakeholders to put your insight into action is vital. And lastly, we're not talking about a one-shot thing here. The gathering of insight is a process, not an event. So as such, it needs regular review to make sure that you're keeping it up to date and as useful as it can be. So this is the Insight into Action webinar. So now it's really over to you. So what I would suggest you do away from here is, off the back of this webinar, work with your activity alliance engagement advisor, and put the plan that we've talked about into action and think about what the steps of that could be. This is a part of lots of other resources that Activity Alliance have for your use and consideration. So have a look. All those resources are freely available via the Activity Alliance website. Also, compare notes with other people in the room, get together over coffee and have a chat, see what they're doing. Also do a bit of desk-based research and see how other organisations have approached the use of insight and put it into action. So I hope it's been a really useful webinar today. Thank you for your time, really appreciate it, and wish you all the best in making a positive difference as you move forward from today.